All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us, either in person or in the future sometime on YouTube. Who knows? If YouTube lasts forever, then so too will this video. What we're going to be talking about today is the sort of lower culture or material culture. There's an idea of high culture, which is art and music and opera. But then there's ordinary culture that most people experience. And we're not talking about like newspapers. We're talking about what people eat and what they wear and how they earn a living, and how they construct families and orient themselves in terms of gender and gender roles. This is the ordinary lived experience. In fact, some might even call this material history as opposed to the elevated history of kings and generals and so on. So we're going to be exploring those. And when we look at this kind of material cultural history or cultural expression, there's a general theme that I think applies to any variety of cultural product. And that is how much of this is produced inside and how much of this is produced with outside influence. And people often have this conception of Jewish culture that it existed in sort of a bubble and went through history without really having a lot of contact with the outside world because they were locked in the ghettos and they were locked in the melach in the Muslim world, and they didn't have exposure to the outside world. They spoke Yiddish and not Russian, so they didn't know anything. Well, but the reality is that there's always a lot of influence from the outside world. If nothing else, you change climates, you're going to change your clothing in general. Because you're going to deal with what's there. You're going to change your diet because if what you ate in one climate doesn't grow in another climate, you can't eat it. So you have to find, and certainly pre-modern container ship shipping of foods, you really had to deal with what you could grow locally. So Jewish life does have some elements that restricted Jews from outside contact, but it didn't always happen in the direction people imagined. So as just one example, I mentioned the ghettos. Most of the ghetto walls in Europe actually had locks on the inside. It was the Jews who locked it to protect themselves on the inside. It was not the outside people who locked them in. That makes a difference, right? This is a barrier you're putting up yourself. So if you decide you want to restrict contact with the outside world, you might say, well, you're not allowed to eat at their house. But you have to put in that kind of a rule because people are inclined to do that. A lot of the rules that required Jews to wear restrictive dress or prevented them from wearing certain clothes or even made them wear a certain, like a yellow circle or a special hat or other examples like this at different periods of time and place. That's done to differentiate Jews from everybody else because otherwise you couldn't necessarily tell. If the Jews were already self-segregating and making themselves obviously different, then you wouldn't have had to have those kind of rules and barriers. So we'll see that there's elements throughout each of the areas we'll look at where Jews are definitely influenced by the outside world, but also sometimes are influencing the outside world as their culture bleeds outward, and also maintaining some things of their own, if not entirely hermetically sealed from the outside world, at least substantially consistent. So let's talk first about Jewish economic history, how Jews earned a living. This is often ignored when people look at the Jewish experience because they talk about Bible commentators like Rashi and famous rabbis and courtiers in the Muslim world, poets and writers, again, this privileging of Jewish verbal culture. But the reality is that most Jews out there weren't those people. They weren't the Rothschilds and bankers. They were something else. They were earning a living. I used to have a joke with the custodian at a synagogue I used to work for who spoke Yiddish, and every day when I came in, he would ask me, "Vos macht a Yid?" which in Yiddish means, "How are you doing?" basically. Literally it is, "What is a Jew doing?" Vos macht a Yid? And the joke answer was always, "Ich mach a Leben," I make a living. So sort of a play on it, but the idea was that people did make a living. But Jews are sometimes uncomfortable talking about Jewish economic history because very often Jews have been in economic roles that have become vilified or that don't gain the kind of respect that a virtuous peasant has in European mentality, where being a middleman doesn't conjure the same kind of thing. Sherwin Wine used to joke, they don't make a lot of statues to businessmen around. There's a lot of military heroes, there's some political heroes, kings. Not a lot of businessmen get statues, but Jews tended to be in those kind of professions or in the small crafts world. So, and we wound up in certain economic niches that have become the fodder for anti-Semitic accusations making the rounds about controlling finance, controlling the stock markets, and so on. And the dilemma is, how do you describe a sociological reality without being an anti-Semite? So, as I think I mentioned in the movies section, if you said Jews run Hollywood, that might be sociological, right? Some Jews run Hollywood. But if you say the Jews run Hollywood, now it becomes a conspiracy. So Jews are involved in the stock market, okay, so are Christians. Some Jews are very involved in the stock market. Some Jews gave their names to financial service firms like Lehman Brothers and, not Morgan Stanley, but I'm thinking of one. I'm blanking on another one. Oh, Goldman Sachs. Yeah. I knew what you meant. Yeah, Goldman Sachs. So there are plenty of examples of Jewish names in finance, but does that mean Jews run the financial markets in a corrupt way? No. Mike Bloomberg is Mike Bloomberg, right? Doesn't necessarily mean he's the Jew Mike Bloomberg. So we have to sort of face the realities of Jewish economic history and be willing to accept what actually happened. Now, if you go back to the earliest periods of Jewish history that we know of, as recorded in archaeology and in the Bible, Jews, like most people, were primarily agricultural. Until you can get sophisticated enough at the technology of agriculture to make a surplus, just about everybody's involved in food production. It's only when you have fertile ground like the Nile Valley or the Mesopotamian space between the Tigris and Euphrates River, those are fertile enough, you can raise enough food that you could have a priestly class, a military class, a scribal class, a royal class. Otherwise, most people are making food most of the time. And so Jews tended to make food in one of two ways. They either farmed the land as sedentary farmers, or they were nomadic shepherds and pastoralists. And they didn't always get along. I mean, if you read the first few chapters of Genesis, you've got Cain and Abel. One is a farmer, one is a shepherd, and they fight. I mean, Rodgers and Hammerstein put it in Oklahoma, the cowman and the farmer should be friends, but they don't get along. That's the point of the song. But even early in this agricultural period, Jews began to become more urbanized. When they moved to other territories or were forcibly moved by exile or war, they tended to settle in cities, both to maintain a sort of cohesive community, but also because their lifestyle had become more urbanized. They became more focused on crafts, some on trade, but they were not really farmers in that sense for most of Jewish history, since certainly the year zero going forward. We tended to be mobile and move, and often when you moved, you didn't become a peasant and start farming land. First of all, because peasants didn't always own the land, they were simply tied to the land. And in fact, like in Eastern Europe, the serfs weren't emancipated until the 1860s, so they were really tied to the land, almost like slaves. And the Jews did not become peasants in that way. They were more mobile, and so they often lived in cities, and they were captive to the arrangements they would make with the local lords or dukes or so on. They would make an arrangement to pay a collective tax on the Jewish community, and then they would be allowed to live there. So they really became somewhat self-sufficient. They had their own butchers because they had certain dietary laws, as we'll talk about, but their own craftsmen, their own tailors and shoemakers and so on that would work with their community and sometimes work with the outside community as well. There were market days where they sent people off to market, and they would travel to major market events. In fact, sometimes the major rabbinic courts would happen to meet around market times because that's when people were traveling and coming together and could make requests for adjudication. Jews began to expand beyond craftsmen into merchants by the time of the Middle Ages. And remember, a merchant is simply a craftsman that can produce a lot more than can be sold locally and needs to sell it somewhere else, or they become a middleman. And the Jews served as a particularly useful middleman in the Middle Ages because they were neither Jewish nor Christian. That is, they could travel between Christendom and Dar al-Islam, where a Muslim trader would have a harder time or a Christian trader might have a harder time crossing that border. The Jews could be multilingual, and they had they had two other advantages. One is they had fellow Jews that they could do trading with, and they had a common system of laws through the Talmud. So if you were, again, a Christian from Venice trying to make it in Egypt, you didn't even have a common system of laws or currency that you could work through, where in Jewish life, you had this Talmudic law system where you could submit a dispute to a rabbi who would judge based on an agreed upon set of laws. So that was a real advantage. So often there were families members sprinkled around, and so even having a local contact would be even easier. You would have people you could stay with, you could eat their food, right, because they're following similar dietary laws. And the other major advantage to having Jewish communities scattered around was piracy, which was a major issue in this period. And if you were on a ship that was caught by pirates, they would actually save Jews because they knew they could ransom them at the nearest port. And the local Jewish community would pay to ransom the Jew from the pirates. So that's a nice insurance policy. If you're going to risk your life and limb out there on the high seas, to know that a community might bail you out if you needed to. So Jews fell into this niche of being this merchant going between the empires, in part because they weren't tied to the land, but also in part because of advantages of the Jewish diaspora. Now, in Christian Europe in particular, they fell into another realm that gets a very bad rap. It's called money lending or banking. Now, the reason why Jews fell into this niche in Christendom had to do with a passage in the Hebrew Bible that says you should not lend to your brother at interest. There's a real, again, sort of a rural fear of interest, where in the urban crafts economy, you understand how interest works. I need to borrow some money from you to get some raw supplies so I can work on it, make it fancier, sell more of them, and then I can pay you back. But there's a risk you're taking, so I have to pay you back more than just what you gave me. That's how the economy works. You need to get loans. Well, in a rural setting, loans are more risky because if the crop doesn't come in, you don't know. If you're working on a craft project, you know it's going to get done. So this is where the urban setting is more comfortable with money lending, but Islam has a strict prohibition on taking interest. They have to come up with complicated business partnerships and other arrangements. And in Christian Europe, it was assumed that Jews could not lend an interest to other Jews, and Christians could not lend an interest to other Christians, but Jews could lend an interest to Christians because they were not in that umbrella of do not lend an interest to your brother. Brother understood to be their own faith community. So they found this niche, those who did develop assets as merchants or as successful craftspeople, and then began this process of money lending, sometimes to other merchants, sometimes to lords, kings, and whatever who needed to hire an army. And the problem with being a moneylender is if you loan to the king or the duke and they decide they don't want to pay you, they expel you, they declare you being uppity, they call down an inquisition of some kind. There's all kinds of ways they can get out of those debts. So it's a high risk, high reward kind of position. And again, this is not the dominant profession for Jews, but it becomes sort of infamously a Jewish profession. Think most famously of the Merchant of Venice. Right. And people think the Merchant of Venice is Shylock, but it's not. The Merchant of Venice is the main character who has this love interest, and Shylock is the villain in the story because he's lending an interest, because he's only interested in getting his money back. In fact, there's even a scene, a very painful scene, I think, in that play, where his daughter has run away. His daughter Jessica falls in love with someone who's not Jewish, and she flees, and she steals some jewels and gold when she leaves. And he has this speech where he laments, "My daughter and my gold," that have both fled, that have both left him. And it's hard to tell from the rhetoric which he is lamenting more. And again, that's, Shakespeare might never have known a Jewish person. They weren't allowed to be out and Jewish in England at the time he was writing. They already expelled the Jews. So he might not have never known a Jewish person. In fact, his play was based on an earlier play called The Jew of Malta. So it's a stereotype for sure. And you can imagine, we play it today as sympathetically as possible to Shylock. You can imagine an earlier era would have played it much more, played up the villainy of Shylock much more because of this reputation of being a moneylender. But Jews were also involved in non-productive enterprises. That is, they didn't necessarily make things themselves to make a living. As one example, because Jews were not tied to the land, they could be what we would today call a peddler. They could go from one space to another space and bring the wares with them. That's actually what many of them did in North America when they moved here in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. That's why a lot of Jewish settlements were along rivers, because the peddlers would travel along the rivers or set up home base with their, department store or, the early dry goods store. And then they would go out peddling periodically to the larger settlements or farms around the area. But they needed the mobility to do that, and the rivers were very important for that. So Cincinnati, Pittsburgh. You think, why is there a Reformed Jewish rabbinical seminary in Cincinnati of all places? In fact, that was the first seminary founded in the United States, was in Cincinnati. You think, why? Well, that's where a lot of those German-speaking Jews wound up because of that need for rivers, and there's a lot of rivers running through that part of the world to help them do that peddling work in between. So being a middleman, again, is not something that earns you a lot of favors, because the craftsmen think you're ripping them off because you're selling it for more, and the people you're selling it to think you're ripping them off because you're selling it for more than they're selling in the city, but you're doing the work of schlepping it back and forth. And sometimes they even became sort of leaseholders or estate managers. So in Eastern Europe, actually in Ukraine, of all places, Polish landowners were often absentee landowners. They owned large tracts of land, but they would do what's called tax farming. They would sell one person the right to manage the estate, so to speak, collect taxes on bridges and so on. So they would get a lump sum and not have to worry about the headache. And then the other person would have to deal with the collections every week to deal with, and of course, nobody likes the tax collector. So Jews served in that role often for these Polish remote landowners in Ukraine. And so when there was a peasant rebellion against those Polish landowners in Ukraine by a Cossack named Bogdan Khmelnytsky, they targeted many Jews who were living in the area. Jews often also served as tavern keepers. Again, you wouldn't think of the Jew running a tavern, but again, it's a kind of middleman role, right? You take the raw material of the grain or the potatoes, and then you process it into the liquor, and then you sell it back. Again, this often led to Jews being, condemned as the corrupting influence on the noble peasantry, but they were trying to make a living in between all the other things. They couldn't, in the feudal economy, Jews were sort of stuck in the middle because they couldn't be peasants. They couldn't necessarily get into the guilds that the burghers controlled in the cities. They had to live in this kind of middle ground and sort of train extra hard, run extra fast to try to make a living in that time period. Keep in mind also that making a living wasn't necessarily the cultural ideal of Jewish life. Remember in Fiddler on the Roof, when Tevye imagines if he were a rich man, right? He doesn't say how he got rich, doesn't matter. But at the end of the song, what is his ideal? If I were rich, I'd have the time that I lack to sit in the synagogue and pray, have a seat by the eastern wall, and discuss the holy books with the learned men 7 hours every day. That would be the sweetest thing of all, he sings. So the ideal was studying the Talmud, studying the law, if you had the leisure to do that. It wasn't just to make money for money's sake. Keep in mind also in the Muslim world, where Jews had similar kinds of professions, middleman jobs, craftsman jobs, merchant jobs, not money lending, obviously, because that wasn't how it worked. They were also physicians and could be involved in government service up to certain levels. But they couldn't necessarily flaunt their wealth because they couldn't be seen as uppity. The Jews in Middle Eastern and Muslim countries were in a position called the dhimmi, or a sort of subordinate minority, where they couldn't be too flashy. They couldn't blow their shofars too high. They couldn't, in some places they couldn't ride on horses in town. They had to walk. And so what you'll find is these beautiful courtyards and interior decorations, but the outside of the house or synagogue often looks very nondescript. So you could become fabulously wealthy and successful in that world, but you couldn't necessarily flash it on the outside. You had to maintain your low profile. Now, everything changes come the 18th, 19th, 20th century. The Industrial Revolution, the Capitalist Revolution, the Free Trade Revolution really transforms the Jews because they are perfectly situated for this new world. They have been trained in the money economy long before capitalism was the dominant form. They are ready to leap forward, where the peasantry, having to move into the cities and become the urban proletariat, are crushed by this new system. Jews are often able to thrive in it because they've been training for this their whole lives, right? It also opens up, as Jews become emancipated, new professions. They can now go into more government service than they ever did. In Christian Europe, too, they can become lawyers. Again, imagine a period with no Jewish lawyers. But in fact, that was the case before Jews could go to law schools, because guess what? Law schools until the 19th century were Christian law. They were canon law, church law. So you wouldn't be studying the law as an abstract secular topic. The first Jew to go to college actually went to medical school in Venice because that was a course of study they could follow. But all the other courses of study were involved in church practice, and so they weren't able to pursue that. Again, an era before Jews went to college. But that wasn't the dominant strain until they become integrated into the surrounding society. Now, sometimes they go into new industries, but as the proletariat. I mean, there are plenty of Jews coming off of the small crafts world, the estate managing, sort of vaguely farming world. I mean, there were Tevias out there who really were milkmen, and they had cows, and that's what they did, or blacksmiths or whatever. So they go to the big cities, or they migrate to the North America, wind up in an urban slum like in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago. They go to work like the other immigrants in heavy industry, often in the garment industry, but not exclusively. And sometimes you had the odd situation where Jews were both the people running the factories because they owned it, and there were Jews working in the factories as the proletariat. And sometimes they would have clashes over whether they were being treated appropriately because of that. And so this is why also at the end of the 19th, early 20th centuries, a lot of Jews are very supportive and involved in unions because they are the working class. But they're a little different than the typical working class worker because in the old country, they might have been their own boss. You know, if they ran their own tailor shop in the shtetl and then they are working in the garment industry in New York in a factory, they still aspire to something else. They're not, you know, just a cog in the machine. Secondly, Jews tended to be literate. They put a strong cultural emphasis on universal, at least male literacy, although many women also knew how to read. They could read Yiddish, if not Hebrew, and that was enough to be literate because Yiddish was an active national language at the time. So being literate is a huge advantage because you can keep your own records, you can learn new skills, you have wider horizons, and you have higher aspirations for your children's generation. Where some of the early union movements wanted the kids to go into the same profession. You know, you think about the Irish police officers whose kids became police officers and firemen, whose grandkids became police officers and firemen. But there were very few Jewish garment workers who wanted their kids and grandkids to be garment workers, even if they were fighting for better working conditions and wages. They wanted them to do something else, something higher, something more respectable. So maybe the second generation becomes a lawyer or a pharmacist or owns a grocery or something, and then the next generation becomes a doctor or can go to graduate school and has, you know, higher level of white collar profession. So Jews definitely have been moving up in that direction as well. I want to share with you a couple examples that demonstrate this transformation of Jewish life, both in terms of urbanization, but also in terms of professional profile. So here we have a chart, this is from the 20s and 30s, of Jewish professions in Europe and what areas they were employed in, also comparing them to non-Jews. So in Poland, for example, in 1931, industry and trade consumed the work of about 45% of Jews and 44% of non-Jews, so that's comparable. When you look at commerce and credit, 38% of Jews were involved in commerce and credit. That's businessmen, that's banking. Only 9% of the non-Jews in Poland at the time were doing that. Communication and transport, non-Jews, a higher proportion of them were doing that. Public service and liberal professions, again, a little higher percentage of non-Jews, but a substantial portion of Jews doing that. And the domestic and personal service, again, non-Jews are much higher represented in that than Jews are. So Jews are much overrepresented in the commerce and credit department, you'll see that. Same is true even in the USSR, which is trying to wipe out commerce and credit, right? It's not something they want to support. Still, Jews are very overrepresented in that department. If you look in, jump onto Germany in 1933, so this is just as the Nazis are taking power, only 18% of Jews are involved in industry and trade compared to 45% of the general population, but almost 50% of Jews are involved in commerce and credit compared to 15% for the general population.
So when you say that, you're talking about the global.
Yes, that's right. I don't know if the chart mentions this. No, it doesn't say. Okay, but again, you get the idea that Jews are overrepresented in some professions and underrepresented in other professions. The next chart describes where Jews lived in the largest city of various countries and what proportion of the country's Jews were that city population. So in Denmark, for example, there were 5,900 Jews in the country, 5,400 of them lived in Copenhagen. 90% of the country's Jews were in the largest city. But this is true in Paris, in France. 70% of all of France's Jews are living in Paris. 67% of all of Austria's Jews. 2/3 of all of England's Jews are in London. In Cairo, Egypt, 50% of the Jews are living there. Even in Germany, which has 560,000 Jews, fully 30% of them, 1/3 of them are living in Berlin. So you can see what a high proportion of Jews are living in these urban settings, and you can imagine that's going to have effects on education, on cultural exposure to the surrounding world. Again, a rural community can be more isolated, but once you're in the big city, you're in the big city, and you're going to be learning the language, you're going to be hearing the music, you're going to be meeting other people, you're going to be doing business with other people. That's going to transform your sense of who you are and how you do your own culture. So that's a quick overview of the economic profile. Now, when it comes to Jewish family life, Jews historically were not monogamous. If you read the Hebrew Bible, there are plenty of examples of patriarchs, kings, other people who choose have more than one wife simultaneously. There are laws that are set up to handle circumstances for more than one wife, so it's clearly a possibility, and rabbinic law accepts this as a possibility as well. And this was the case for Jews all over the Jewish world until about the year 1000 of the Common Era. In the year 1000 of the Common Era, a Rabbi Gershom in Worms in Germany decided that for Ashkenazi Jews, for Northern European Jews, they would only be allowed to marry one wife. And that's because the surrounding culture only supported marrying one wife. Christianity was monogamous. But in the Middle East, Jews continued to be able to marry more than one wife until the modern period. Now, the funny thing about Rabbi Gershom's rule was that in the year 1000, he put in a 1,000-year ban on polygamy. Now, if you do the math, it expired. Right. Now, unless you go out and set up a JDate profile or something. The rabbis around the year 2000 that are authoritative in the Orthodox world said, we're going to extend this ban indefinitely because this is what we've done for 1,000 years and we're not going to change it now. So there are very few Jews today who are polygamous, because even the Middle Eastern Jews who had multiple wives, who brought them to Israel when they were cleared out of Arab countries, were told, well, you can keep the ones you have, but you can't marry anymore. So there's very, very few Jewish polygamists out there these days. But any society that even countenances polygamy tends to put women on a lower status. If they allowed polyandry with multiple husbands, maybe that'd be equal opportunity, but this was not the circumstance at the time. And gender roles were very strictly defined in Jewish life. I was mentioning before our class started that there are occasional references to more than just the two male-female binary genders in rabbinic law, but in general, my understanding is that they are sort of the odd cases. Somebody's born and looks androgynous, or somebody's born with elements of both sex organs, or changes when they hit puberty from one to the other. And they have these terms for each of these cases. They're not necessarily affirming those as equally viable options. They are the odd cases we have to come up with laws to deal with those unusual circumstances. But by and large, it's a binary system. You can tell this very early on. The very first collection of rabbinic law, called the Mishnah, has 6 major sections. And one of those major sections is called Nashim, women. So it's for all the laws that apply to that weird case called women. So laws of marriage, and laws of divorce, and laws of what's called levirate marriage, if you've got a woman whose husband dies without providing an heir, or laws of menstrual impurity, and laws of ketubas, marriage contracts. So all those laws are collected into this one section called women, as if it only applies to them. But of course, the marriage contract applies to the husband too, but they decided to label that one the women. Anyway, so the point is that there's very clearly a male and female split. For example, when you're writing out a blessing, and you write one form for a woman to say and one form for a man to say, they don't include a form for androgynous to say and a form for, they're not treating those as equal genders. Today we might, but in the rabbinic period they weren't. And there clearly was a hierarchy as well. So the famous example of this is a traditional morning blessing, where a man says, thank you, God, for not making me a slave, and not making me a non-Jew, and not making me a woman. Shelo asani isha, who did not make me a woman. And the woman says, thank you, God, for not making me a slave, and not making me a non-Jew, and for making me according to his will. Now, you can find apologetics that try to explain why that's not offensive, but most readers read it as offensive. And in a lot of cases, women are exempted from certain commandments that men are obligated to follow. And you might think, oh, that's good, right? They have less to do. Except the things that they're exempted from are some of the most high profile, valued rituals. Reading from a Torah scroll at the synagogue, right? You would think, well, wouldn't you want to do that? But the problem is that unless you're commanded to do it, you can't replace someone else doing it. So the idea is in a synagogue, everyone's commanded to read the Torah scroll a certain number of times in the week. But if one person reads on behalf of everybody and you listen to it and respond appropriately, then it's as if everyone read it. But that only happens if the person reading it is fully commanded as everybody else is. And since the woman is exempt from that commandment because it's time specific and also because she might be, impure and she shouldn't touch the Torah because she might be impure, this is one of those cases where women are exempted out of privilege. They're put into a more subordinate role because the thought is, well, they're home with their kids, their role is to support their husbands. In fact, there's even an explicit passage in rabbinic literature that says, how does a man merit the world to come? He studies Torah, he does good deeds. How does a woman merit the world to come? She supports her husband and son studying Torah. Not that she does it herself. So, again, you've got plenty. I don't have to go into exhaustive depth on this. There's a reason why Jewish feminists had a lot to complain about when they started their activism in the 1970s. Women couldn't serve as witnesses in rabbinic courts. Women couldn't initiate a divorce. The man had to be the one to initiate the divorce and do what's called give the woman a get, a formal divorce document. Now, Jewish life did allow for divorce. Even in the Hebrew Bible, there's a passage in Deuteronomy that says if a man wants to divorce his wife, he writes her a bill of divorcement and sends her away. So there was a capacity for divorce. That is good. If marriages need to end, then they should. There's also a principle that the woman had to consent to the marriage. This goes back to the story of looking for a wife for Isaac. They go to ask Rebecca, will you go with this man? And she has to say yes, although she could have said no in theory. And rejected it. So even in the rabbinic wedding ceremony, the groom says a special phrase to the woman and puts a ring on her finger, on her index finger, but she herself has to move it to her ring finger as a sign of agreeing to the wedding. It's her positive affirmation. When the ketubah is written, it is given, and she makes a positive gesture of receiving the ketubah. And so that becomes a special symbol. So, and a sign of affirmative choice and free will in choosing it. So again, these are elements we might celebrate, but we also should remember that in the Middle Ages, arranged marriages were the rule of the day. Marrying for love as a free choice is not traditional marriage. So anybody who says they want old-fashioned marriage, they don't know what they're talking about from a historical perspective. Well, maybe they do want to go back to the arranged marriage, or certainly they might not like the idea of divorce. And we also have to talk about the whole question of sex, because in Jewish life, there is a positive, affirmative value of sexual pleasure and regular sexual practice within marriage. It's only within marriage, not beyond. And again, men are more free to do this than women because, in theory, they could acquire more than one wife, so having sex around is less of a concern for them. But it was still thought that there should be positive sexual relations between husbands and wives in that setting. Obviously, no exceptions of homosexual relationships or partnerships before modern times. And there was also a positive commandment to be fruitful and multiply. It goes back to Genesis, right? So much so that if a man were married to a woman and she didn't have children within a certain period of time, that could be enough reason to divorce her and then marry someone else, because the man had a positive affirmative commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Technically, it only applies to the man because it was given to Adam before Eve pops out in chapter 2. So it was understood by the rabbis that the man had to procreate, had to produce children. And there's often a strong taboo in Orthodox Jewish practice against birth control. One of the other things that happens in Orthodox Jewish practice is that women are rendered menstrually impure every month. And not just for the week of the actual menstruation, but also for a week after that, to make sure that the menstrual blood is totally cleared up from the body. And then, in fact, they have to go through an inspection, inspect the cloth, and make sure everything's clear. But what this does, because while she's menstrually impure, they can't even sit on the same bed. They can't touch the same objects. They have to put things down and then have the other person pick them up. They're handed one to the other. They don't touch physically. Well, what this does when you're not allowed to touch your spouse for 2 weeks in a row is it concentrates sexual behavior in the 2 most fertile weeks for this typical cycle. And so it does produce an extreme fertility. Now, before modern times, extreme infant mortality, knocked that down, but enter modern medicine and you have a huge population boom in the 19th century in Europe. Jewish population doubles twice, I think, between 1800 and 1900 in Eastern Europe, despite all the immigrants leaving. And it's because the birth rate stays high and the fertility is focused in that period as a result of these taboos on menstruation. So what about Jewish clothes? Well, in many times and places, Jews dressed like everybody else. As I mentioned, they had to put special markers to make sure you knew who was Jewish and who wasn't. But over time, Jewish life began to sort of calcify. So in 17th century Poland, and in 18th century Poland in particular, with the rise of the Hasidic movement, the thought was they decided we need to stop now because the Enlightenment, the emancipation, all this modernization is changing things. We don't want to change anything, even what we're wearing. So ironically, the clothing that is thought today to exemplify ultra-Orthodox Judaism was typical Polish nobility outfits in the 1700s. And the Amish did a similar thing. They froze it at a certain time, and they, even if it, it had no ideology originally to it, they come up with an ideology later about modesty and so on, but that changes over time. But that's where the idea of the black cat starts. And that's why I mentioned when you move to new climates, you change your clothing. The exception are the ultra-Orthodox living in Israel because they've decided they're not allowed to change their clothing. So you get these people walking around in long hats and garments and big fur hats, even in the middle of summer in Israel. I mean, you can bust an artery there. Yeah, right. I mean, you're asking for it there. But people will do crazy things for what they believe, and they've decided that the clothing they wear is as important to them as any of these other ritual practices. The minhag, the custom of wearing the clothing, theoretically should be flexible within some parameters. So maybe you have some modesty guidelines of how long the sleeve should be or how long the skirt needs to be, but what color it is, maybe that doesn't matter. And Jews in the Middle East wore very different clothing than Jews in Europe. Again, very similar to the surrounding culture, but even the yarmulkes, the men's head covering that you'll see in Eastern Europe is very different from what you'll see in Yemen or in other cultures. Now there's some crossover because people, can pick what they want of the variety. But in the Middle Ages, when there wasn't a lot of travel, you wore what everybody around you said you should wear. There's other distinctive Jewish clothing items: the kippah, the yarmulke, the head covering that traditionally was showing your devotion to God. The idea of a prayer shawl that you would wear for certain ritual moments called a talit or a talis. And a special white garment you'd wear a few times a year. You wear it once on Yom Kippur, you wear it once at Passover, you wear it when you get married, you wear it when you get buried. It's called a kittel. It's a special white robe for those purposes. And again, white for purity, and you can understand that. So that's a quick survey of Jewish dress. So now I want to talk to you about Jewish foods. Actually, I've got a PowerPoint that talks about this. Get to the PowerPoint slideshow. Okay. So this is trying to define what Jewish food is. And one of the complexities in understanding Jewish food is that the Jewish world has evolved its food over time. And sometimes what we think of now as Jewish food is, in fact, customary food for where they lived. And they kept it as they moved, and then it becomes distinctively Jewish. So the bagel, for example, there were examples of boiled and then baked breads in Eastern Europe. It's not unique to Jews. The idea of bread with a hole in the middle goes back to Roman times. They used to make loops of bread because you put it on a stick and then you can sell it and carry it around much easier. So neither of those is uniquely Jewish. Same thing with lox. As I mentioned before, the German word for lox, for salmon is lox. The Swedish word for salmon is lox. So it's just, what Germanic languages call salmon. So it's not uniquely Jewish either. Okay, let's get this moving. So certain foods you could say are clearly Jewish because they're prescribed and eaten specifically by Jews on specific holidays. So as one example, coming up we have Passover, and there is a food that is specifically prescribed to be eaten on Passover. going back to the earliest text we have, it's called matzah, right? It says explicitly in Exodus, you will keep the feast of matzot on this very day throughout the ages. In the first month, from the 14th day until the 21st, you eat only matzot, only unleavened bread. So matzah is clearly Jewish food, especially matzah during Passover. I mean, matzah during Passover is Jewish food because it's prescribed by Jewish tradition. It's eaten by Jews. It's been celebrated over the century. It's unambiguously Jewish food. Now, you can also eat it differently, of course, because this is matzah ball soup. Matzah ball soup is not prescribed in the Torah. It's not described in detail in the Talmud. It's an adaptation based on the tradition of chicken soup and based on Eastern European diet. I mean, having carrots, for example, and onions and other vegetables you might add to that. I can imagine doing matzah balls very differently in the Middle East. They didn't do matzah ball soup, as I understand it, in that part of the world. That is an Ashkenazi style thing. In some ways, the matzah balls replace the kreplach, the dumplings that you would have had. Right, exactly. It's a dumpling replacement, which is very Eastern European, right? Pierogi and whatever. Okay. So other examples of Jewish holiday foods. In fact, Passover has a lot of them. You've got the lamb shank, you've got the hard-boiled egg, you've got the parsley, you've got the charosed, you've got the bitter herbs. Right? These are all prescribed to be eaten either by Bible or by rabbinic law, and certainly have been eaten in many times and places by different Jews, but sometimes differently. So European Jews make their charosed, which is a spread that goes on matzah, with apples, where Middle Eastern Jews make it with dates, because it's more in season at that time. And it looks more like the mortar that was used to make bricks. That's the idea. The story behind the charosed is it's like the mortar for the bricks for building the pyramids. That's the legend of it anyways. So the date paste actually looks more like mortar than the apples and honey, but it's not academic here. Now, the other quirky part is that sometimes what is Jewish food for one holiday isn't for another one. So challah is totally fine as a Jewish holiday food on Shabbat, but not during Passover. If you have challah during Passover, then it's not by technical Jewish law Jewish food, even though some people might still feel Jewish about it. Again, it's a subjective thing as opposed to a culture-wide thing. Other examples of special Jewish holiday foods, you've got these triangle-shaped cookies called hamantashen that are part of Purim. You've got latkes, the potato pancakes. You can argue for which is better, sour cream or applesauce. There's something like them both. You've got these jelly donuts called sufganiyot that are a Hanukkah tradition in the Middle East and among Sephardic Jews in Istanbul, because they're also boiled in oil, not potatoes. Because potatoes are more of a Northern European thing coming from the Native Americans, but the jelly donuts for for Hanukkah is a more common feature in the Middle East. You have on the Jewish New Year the tradition of apples and honey, right? Dip the apples in the honey. And then, of course, on Christmas Day, there's the Jewish tradition of eating Chinese food. Now, this is, again, not prescribed by the Talmud or anything, but in America, certainly. Yeah, right. But in America, the odd thing is that because all the restaurants were closed and Jews had nothing to do, the tradition became, we'll go to the movies, which were open, and we'll eat Chinese food. And so Chinese food, it's not Jewish food any other time of the year, but on December 25th. Well, and in most years, the kosher didn't matter. So we'll talk about that concept right now, in fact. Traditionally, you have these Jewish food rules of kosher, which is acceptable, and you have treif, which is not kosher. So that's the opposite. I mean, kosher is now an English word today. People will understand what you mean. They might not get treif, but you understand. It's the opposite. Now, I will point out, by the way, that this practice of keeping kosher is a minority practice in the American Jewish community. So keeping kosher in the home, only 20% of American Jews said that they kept kosher in the home. And notice it's kosher in the home. That means they might eat not kosher food out of the home, but they might keep a kosher home either for personal practice or because they want to have relatives able to come over or whatever the dynamic is. But again, if you asked keep kosher at all times, that number would be even lower. Compare that to fasting on Yom Kippur, twice as likely. Participating in a Seder, that happens way more often than participating in keeping kosher at home. So as we talk about the kosher laws, keep in mind this is historic Jewish practice, but not necessarily what every Jew does today. So now, do we as humanistic Jews have any particular food rules? Well, we have a couple. One is you want to generally eat healthy. This is probably an example of what not to do, trying to eat that whole thing. In general, you don't want to create waste with that. There's even a concept now called eco-kosher, where even if it's kosher food, if you eat it on a styrofoam plate, maybe it shouldn't count. To try to worry about packaging and pollution, global warming, all those kind of factors. And for some people, they have ethical concerns. The animals are cute. They don't deserve to die. So people are vegetarians or vegans. They're ethical eating rules, but not necessarily ritual eating rules. Okay, and people find their own middle grounds. It might be pescatarian or ovo-pescatarian or lacto-ovo-pescatarian or whatever the balancing that they're finding. Now, Jews have a whole series of rules regarding animals, and they're divided up in different categories. So here's some of the rules about land animals. You can eat from any animal with a true hoof, that has a cleft in the hoof, so not a solid hoof, but a split hoof, and that chews its cud. It has to do both. Now, an interesting feature, all of those animals that do that are vegetarians. They don't eat other animals. So like a lion doesn't have a hoof, right? Now, one that only chews the cud or only has the true hoof, you cannot eat it. So a camel, for example, it chews a cud, but it doesn't have a hoof, so you can't eat it. The rabbit also chews the cud, but doesn't have any hoofs. And the pig, it has hoofs, with the hoofs cleft, but it doesn't chew its cud, so you can't eat the pig. And then the allowed animals are things like a cattle, right, that chews cud, cleft hoof. You've got the goat, cleft hoof, chews its cud. And you've got that lamb. Doesn't matter how cute it is, because the dietary laws are about what you're allowed to eat, not allowed to eat, and it has nothing to do with the ethics involved. This has been one of the sort of revelations when there was that big scandal in Iowa, maybe 15, 20 years ago, where this meat processing plant was a kosher meat processing plant, but they were totally abusing the immigrant workers who were doing the slaughter. And some people were shocked. They said, I thought kosher laws were about ethics. No, it's about how the animal's killed and what happens to the blood. And the compassion for the animal didn't matter, and the compassion for the people didn't matter either. So yes, it's true. Even if the animal is cute, they might still be yummy and allowed in Jewish practice.
Is there any rationale for some of this? I mean, I've read through all those rules. These are things,
right.
Some of these things they don't even know what they are.
So one speculation of the rationalization for it is that it might have been a kind of economic boycott between the hill country Judeans and the coastal plain Canaanites. So the coastal plain Canaanites had more settled agriculture, so they could raise pigs, for example. Pigs are not a pastoral nomadic animal, right? They're not a goat, they're not cattle, they're not sheep. Where the hill country pastoralists might have had minimal settled agriculture, but not enough to pasture animals, so their animals were the goats and the cattle that they could wander around with them. So they were eating their native animals and not eating the animals that those other people would eat. Now, this also applies to sea animals. Remember, the Canaanites are living on the coast, so they get access to the Mediterranean, all kinds of varieties of sea creatures. For the Israelites who have access to maybe the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, they say you should only eat something that has fins and scales. An ordinary fish, fins and scales. But anything with no fins and scales, the swarming things of the water, those are an abomination for you. So the lobster or the shrimp or the eel, right? These are all like weirdo things and blech, you shouldn't touch those. So some of it is just having a taboo, right? If you want to, there's a whole section of laws in the Torah that define A or B. They don't even want you to wear a piece of clothing with linen and wool in the same garment, because they're separate. You can't plow with two kinds of animals in a field. Who cares what you're plowing with? But again, keep separate things separate. A man can't wear a woman's clothing and vice versa. That's also keeping separate things separate. So, Jewish food rules apply to birds too. Now, some you do not eat among the birds. They are an abomination. Let's see what they are. The eagle, the vulture, the black vulture, the kite, falcons. What do you notice about those? They're carnivores, right? Right. And then the ones you are allowed are things like a chicken. Now they eat bugs, right? But not necessarily other animals. A duck would count. Even a turkey would count, although this turkey says eat ham, like don't eat me. But there would be birds that would be not allowed. The trafe birds would be like the eagle, it's a predator, and the bat, which is just weird, but also a predator. Evidently, it was an option. You don't prohibit things people aren't doing. Now, one thing that we wouldn't necessarily include in permitted food is insects, but that is part of the canon of what's allowed in traditional Jewish dietary practice. So all winged swarming things that walk on all fours are disgusting, but these you may eat among the winged swarming things that walk on all fours, all that have above their feet jointed legs to leap with on the ground. You can eat locusts of every variety, all variety of bald locusts, crickets of every variety, and all variety of grasshoppers. So you want something kosher to eat, hops on your plate, chow down. I mean, there is a utility to allowing people to eat locusts.
Well, yeah.
If the locust shows up, you better eat them because they just ate everything else. Right. But there's plenty of other bugs that you are not allowed to eat because they don't fit this definition. Yeah. Well, you know, the odd thing is that bugs are actually a great source of protein because they have very low fat. They live on garbage, and they don't take a lot of energy to raise at all. They very few greenhouse gases are produced by them or anything like that. But they can be a real source of valuable protein. The problem is people don't like the crunch factor.
Yeah.
So what they talked about doing is grinding them up into powders that get mixed into other foods. So you still get the protein with limited fat. It's like less fat than fish even. But you wouldn't get the ick factor of chewing on a wing or something like that.
One of the things the steps of Central Asia.
Yes, that's right. Right. So in the steppes of the Middle East also, evidently, these were allowed as foods by rules. Now the rabbis added some laws to these Torah laws that were given that define what animals were allowed or not. The most famous one is the concept that you shall not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, which the rabbis took to mean you cannot have dairy and meat in the same meal. So what counts as dairy? That's milk products, cheese, etc. What counts as meat? Beef, lamb, and also chicken. Now you might say, chickens don't have milk. So if it's boiling a baby in its mother's milk, then why? Well, chicken looked enough like the other meats, they said, forget it, you can't do it. No chicken parmesan, that's out. But there's a third category of milchig is milk, dairy, fleischig is meat in Yiddish, and the third is parv, which is neutral. So it could go either way. You can eat it with either one. So as one example, rice, right? You could have rice with meat. You could have rice with dairy. Doesn't matter. Same thing for all the vegetables. You can have those with either ones. Those go either way. One other interesting example of parv, there are two animals that themselves are not kosher to eat, but their product is kosher to eat. The first are bees. You can eat honey, right? Apples and honey, but you can't eat the bee. And the other is human beings. You can't eat people, but you can eat breast milk. And the irony is that breast milk is parv. It's not dairy. It's neutral. Parv, yeah. Right. Exactly. So what it says is you could eat it with a milk dish or you could eat it with a meat dish. And there's even rules about how long you have to wait after eating one or the other. Some people have separate dishes for, they have meat dishes and milk dishes and meat knives and dairy knives and keep everything. Some have different sinks even. Some have two refrigerators to keep them separate. Yeah. Right. So, there's a joke related to this where this man is traveling back from Israel to New York and they open his suitcase to inspect it and they find he has 5 sets of dentures in his suitcase. And they say, why do you have 5 sets of dentures? Well, this first set, these are my meat dentures. And the second set, these are my dairy dentures. And then the third set, these are my kosher for Passover meat dentures because there's the rules of Passover diet. And then I have kosher for Passover dairy dentures. Okay, that's 4. What about number 5? Oh, those are my trafe dentures. That's what I used to eat the non-kosher food. Okay, so this is just one example of this. Also, the rules about animal sacrifice are defined by the rabbis. You cannot have any blood consumed, as it described in Leviticus. The life of the animal is its blood. You pour out its blood. And so kosher slaughter is defined around the best way to extract as much blood as possible from the animal. And then you also salt the meat later to soak up any blood. If you're baking, you break an egg into a separate dish so that there's no blood spot in it. And then you can add it. If there's no blood spot, you can add it to the main dish, but you want to break it separately, just in case there's some blood. So there's a definite abhorrence of blood in Jewish foods. What's the irony for this? You ever heard of the blood libel? This accusation that Jews used Christian blood in their matzahs as a kind of demon wafer. Well, but if you know anything about the Jewish dietary laws, there's an importance even of animal blood in these in any food that you would eat. So we're not going to get into the pictures of kosher animal slaughter. I'm not going to demonstrate that. But you get the idea that this is a whole set of laws around this and how to define that as impure. So when you're trying to define Jewish food today, there are the stereotypical things people will think of. As I mentioned, bagels, which are identified with Jews. Again, not unique to Jews, but they brought them over from the old country and now they're connected with Jews. Keep in mind also, some stuff happens here that isn't original to the native country. When we think of St. Patrick's Day, people think of corned beef and cabbage, but that's not a native Irish food. A dish. That's something that evolved for the Irish in New York. And I think they even got the corned beef from the Jews, if I remember right. But it wasn't something that was native to eating in Ireland itself. In fact, the only place you can get it in Ireland on St. Patrick's Day are the tourist dives that are looking to get the tourists. Of course, with Jews returning to the Middle East in great numbers with the Zionist movement, falafel now has become a Jewish food identified with Israeli culture. There's some argument over whether they're co-opting it from Palestinians or not, just like everything else. That's an ongoing political debate. You have this dessert dish called rugelach, which is a special Eastern European dish that's usually sweet with chocolate or raspberry kind of fillings. You have this dish, which is a Moroccan dish called shakshuka, which is eggplant and tomatoes and fried eggs that's mixed all together. It does look very good. I've actually never had it, but I keep telling myself next time you go somewhere that has it, you should get them. All right. And then, of course, there's a stereotypical deli food like this corned beef sandwich. But I included this particular version of a corned beef sandwich because this is a not kosher version of a corned beef sandwich because it has cheese on it. Think about the Reuben sandwich, right? It's got a corned beef on rye with lettuce, tomato, and Russian dressing, which is a dairy-based dressing. How could that be Jewish? Well, the point is that Jewish food is what Jews eat. It's not necessarily what Jews were told to eat historically. It's what they've chosen to eat, and sometimes they eat it around certain holidays. I mean, there are Jews, for example, who are vegetarian, who don't put a lamb shank on their Seder plate because they don't want a lamb bone anywhere near them. So some of them put a beet on the plate because it is red. It has sort of evoking of the blood, even if it's not there. Other people will put a sweet potato in place of the bone because it's reminding them of the Passover yam instead of the Passover lamb. Ha 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 ha. Oh, it's terrible. But Jewish life is about joking, if nothing else. So you can have. You got some pickles mixed in with the falafel up there, but. Here again, people think of Ashkenazi Jewish food as Jewish food, but there's a lot of Middle Eastern Jewish foods that are very different. And also, again, getting back to the kosher rules, I think about in Highland Park, there are two Jewish restaurants right next to each other in a strip mall at the Lake Cook Road and Skokie Highway. One is called Max's Deli, and it's not kosher. It serves sandwiches like this and pork and all kinds of other stuff, bacon with the eggs and so on. And right next to it is a kosher restaurant called Mizrahi Grill, which is Israeli-style Middle Eastern food. And that is kosher, that is closed on Friday nights and Saturday mornings, and runs by Jewish dietary laws. They're both Jewish food. They're right next to each other. But it's hard to argue that only one is Jewish food and the other one is not, when Jews frequent both. And I actually went to Mizrahi Grill once, and I ran into a member of our congregation there, and she said, my daughter doesn't like it, so she went next door to Max's Deli to get something carry out. I'm getting carry out from here, she's getting carry out from there. So that's Jewish food, is making those choices. I guess the last aspect of Jewish lifestyle to touch on is the question of whether there is a Jewish personality. I mentioned that making bad jokes is Jewish. Well, I mean, there are other cultures that have comedians too, right? But people sometimes will point to the Ashkenazi Eastern European Jewish personality, the Woody Allens and the Jackie Masons and the Mel Brookses and that whole Borscht Belt comedian world as exemplifying a certain kind of Jewish personality. I don't know that it's uniquely Jewish to have that those mannerisms and that behavior. There may be something in the Ashkenazi experience that led Jews to laugh rather than cry, given the experiences they had had, or make fun of themselves to get people laughing with them, even if it's laughing with them at them as a defense mechanism. I mean, there's certainly an aspect to Jewish skepticism that fits because there's all these promises that God's going to watch out for you. And as Tevye says in the Fiddler on the Roof movie and in the Shalom Aleichem stories, if this is what it's like to be the chosen people, once in a while choose somebody else. Cut us a break here. So maybe there is a Jewish personality, but it's hard to put your finger on because it's going to be different in different times and places. You even look at a collection of Jewish humor, and the kind of jokes that Mizrahi Jews would tell is very different than the kind of jokes that Soviet Jews would tell, or that Eastern European Jews or American Jews might tell. So, be that as it may, you can decide for yourself if there really is a Jewish personality or not. So with that, I'll stop talking. I'm just going to switch our microphone to the shared speakerphone in case anybody in the room wants to ask any questions. So what are your thoughts on Jewish lifestyle and diet, or any questions you might have about what we covered today?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of this, as you started off with, is heavily influenced by the cultural area and context in which these things grow up. I mean, you talk about a Jewish personality. I think about a New York Jewish personality in a sense.
Right.
But that is a very specific geographical area with very specific types of Jews that came from specific geographical areas.
That's funny because whenever I talk about a New York personality, Brenda always corrects me and says, "No, that's Jewish personality."
Well, but if you're talking Jewish people in New York are Jewish, I mean that's one of the things.
But I know, but I grew up with thinking of it as being New York. She's from New York, and she says it's a Jewish personality.
And she's right, because I mean, in my high school, kids who were like Irish or Italians didn't act the same way that people like my dad, and stuff like that would act. And there was a difference, and they were New Yorkers, but they were.
It's true, but somehow I didn't think anybody but Jews lived in New York, I guess, because those kind of people I thought were New Yorkers.
But think of Mike DeSaro, Senior. He's a kid from Brooklyn, just like my dad was a kid from Brooklyn. They're not taught anything alike.
Well, but also if you look at Jews in St. Louis, or Jews in Houston,
or Charleston, South Carolina,
or Charleston, South Carolina, absolutely, their experiences are very different, and their style of life is very different. Their the sense of humor, all that is going to be very different. Their ethics and values, dress, all that stuff. So it's tough to say that it's a universal Jewish personality when it's maybe time and place specific. So just because there's multiple sub-Jewish cultures doesn't mean they can't have something in common. It's harder to pinpoint when it comes to personalities, but when it comes to food or dress or economic profile, maybe you can put your finger on it a little bit more clearly, because there seems to be this common pattern across time and place that Jews tended not to want to become factory laborers. They did not generally go into large, heavy industry. Some of that was that it was already taken by other people, but they were in a position to move into new industries. So if Carnegie was already running and U.S. Steel was already owned by the time the Jews became affluent enough to go into big industry, maybe they start a new industry like the movies, and so they're able to put their money into that. In fact, a lot of the movie magnates made their money somewhere else. Carl Laemmle, for example, from it was Universal Pictures, made his money making gloves, and then he went into movies. Or some of them even ran movie theaters and then decided they could make the movies that they were showing in their own theaters, and then that would give them sort of an end-to-end production cycle.
It's very heavily into the garment industry, though, interestingly. I mean, my great uncle, Oscar Schiller, made his money in the Bronx, in the clothing stores, basically. And my Uncle Harvey, same thing, clothing store in Fall River. And But he was from Fall River, and he was very different than my family from Brooklyn. It was just, I mean, and that's not that far apart, but Massachusetts versus New York was quite different.
Well, that's why it's tough to put your finger on a personality when the surrounding environment makes such a difference. I'm just looking at our discussion questions that are in the packet to see if there's anything worth highlighting here. Well, when we think about the gender relations question, is there anything that we would celebrate out of that historical background?
You mean like Esther or Ruth or something like that, or?
Well, maybe so. Maybe you can point to those famous people, and that becomes a source of pride. You can talk about the option for divorce at some point. The very idea of a ketubah, by the way, this marriage agreement, gave the divorced woman some financial security. So that if the man were to divorce her, she had to double her dowry, basically, and that would become what her assets would be. Now, of course, that was a disincentive to divorce, because you have to pay all that money. So that maybe a negative there. There's certainly no-fault divorce, in that time period. But that's a case where it supported some sexual activity, for example, within the partnership, but it also limited freedom to choose one's partner. I don't know why this is producing some sounds here.
I don't think someone's talking about it.
Yeah, I don't think so, though. Well, we'll mute George and see if it's someone complaining about him being up at 3 in the morning in Romania. In any case.
This is interesting. Now you're going to talk more about gender relationships in a different lecture, right? But I'm curious to know, I mean, when you look at that, what kind of restrictions? I'm far more familiar with restrictions in Muslim communities on women than I am in Jewish communities.
Right.
Because I really don't know anything but more reform and,
Right.
And that was always very open, but, but I mean, my grandmother was never expected to work, for example. I mean, when I knew her, I mean, the idea of her working with, but I don't know what she did as a young woman.
That's actually assimilation to American culture. In Eastern Europe, women did work. They would run the books in the store. Yeah. They sometimes would work to enable the man to study. They would go to the marketplace. It was not a queen of the home kind of sitting at home all the time.
Morality from
it's more middle class morality, exactly. Yeah. So women were assumed to be in charge at home. They could handle the kosher laws at home and so on. They enforced that. And they certainly raised the kids.
But women could go out by themselves and things. I mean, they don't need to have a male escort.
Right. It wasn't as strict as the Wahhabist Islam. But again, remember, Wahhabi Islam isn't as flexible as some medieval Islamic practice too. Yeah. I mean, there are certainly sects in Jewish life that are very restrictive on women's freedom and on even their clothing. They prescribe exactly what kind of pantyhose they can wear and how long the sleeves have to be and how long the skirts have to be. Yeah. I mean, there's even one sect that has gone back and photoshopped old pictures of the Rebbe's wives to give them longer sleeves to match the current mores, when in the 1920s they could wear a cutoff sleeve or a short sleeve. Now they have to wear long sleeves, so they went back and changed the pictures so they match the current values. And the old picture goes down the memory hole, quote George Orwell. There are certainly policing of women's sexuality, policing of women's freedom, the understanding of women as being in a more subordinate capacity. The curriculums are different in ultra-Orthodox Jewish boys' schools and ultra-Orthodox Jewish girls' schools. Sometimes actually the girls have it better because they learn more English, where the boys spend all their time studying Talmud and English is a denigrated subject. For the girls, at least, they learn enough English that they can actually get a job or become a teacher or have some facility in the outside culture. But remember also, these arranged marriages happen usually by the time they're 16, 17, 18 years old. So if they do decide they want to leave, that might not happen until they're 20 or 25, and by then they've got 3 kids and they're tied in the community, and it's very rare that you get a couple that would agree that they both want to leave at the same time. That would be wonderful, but all too often it becomes a custody battle as much as everything else. Not to mention the fact that these are cultures that do not accept homosexuality. So if somebody is gay or lesbian or transgender, it is totally beyond the bounds of what the community can handle, and they become totally ostracized and or sadly, have mental health issues, suicide, and so on, because they're so rejected. And there's even been a highlighting now of how the repressive sexual mores of that community lead to the risk of sexual abuse, because kids don't even have the vocabulary to describe what's happened to them. And they feel like it's their fault, that they tempted someone. The whole idea of temptation, that you're a temptation if you do this. A woman shouldn't walk in front of a man because she becomes a temptation to him, and he starts to lust after her. A woman shouldn't sing because her voice is a temptation to the man. Of course, you could tell the men, control yourselves.
Yeah, this is very much like radical Islam as well, too. I mean, they have the same sorts of attitudes. Like, it's women have sexual power that men can deal with, and so therefore we have to control women so that men can be protected, which is a very odd way of putting it,
Well,
quite
they
frankly.
grew out of the same basic culture. I mean,
Well, they did. I mean, when you talk about the restrictions, I mean, I can hear it in the Quran, the same echoes of these things. The
Right.
divorce, the witnesses, all this sort of thing.
Right. So, and again, there are times and periods where Jewish women had more rights or authority or leniency.
Yeah.
And there are obviously wide disagreements within the Jewish world in this. I mean, you have Reform, conservative, Reconstructionist, humanistic communities accept women rabbis. Even in modern Orthodox settings now, women are assuming para-rabbinic or semi-rabbinic roles. Some of them are accepting them as deciding Jewish law, or enacting, helping to interpret rules of family purities. You don't have to go to a male rabbi to tell you if your underwear is still menstrual or not. So there are all kinds of areas where progress has been made, even in self-labeled Orthodox communities. But there's still progress to go. In some places, it hasn't gone far enough, and in the most strict communities, that kind of strict gender policing still goes on. And you can't say it's not Jewish because they're drawing on Jewish sources to prove it, but it's not the dominant trend in Jewish life. Most Jews are in that gender egalitarian world. Again, the ones keeping kosher are 20%, and some of those are conservative Jews who are gender egalitarian. The Orthodox represent 10%, 15% at most of the American Jewish community, so that means 85% are non-Orthodox and wouldn't get caught up on this kind of stuff. All right, well, I think we'll wrap up there. So next time we meet, we're going to be talking about Jewish languages. It's a very important part of culture.
That's interesting, yeah.
How you speak and what you sing in, and how you understand the world. Language can help to define concepts. I mean, just to give you one example from a Jewish language, there's a phrase in Yiddish for the people you're married to because your kids got married. It's your machatonim. It's the people, like how my father is related to my father-in-law. They are machatonim. They're related because their kids got married to each other.
Oh.
Right? There's no word for that concept in English.
there is in Spanish.
But there is in Spanish. And some other cultures have the...
Dores, is that it?
I don't remember the term.
Don't look at me.
But there are those, different cultures have certain concepts embodied in a word. I remember reading once that in Japanese there's a word for the truth that everyone knows is false, but everyone says is true. And there's another word for the truth that everybody says is true, but everybody knows is false. They're like the opposite concept. So they have one word for each of those concepts. So this is where language is important, to understand how you're speaking and where and why, how it evolves over time, and even how it's written makes a difference. A lot of Jewish languages, as we'll see, were written in the same alphabet, even if they're radically different languages. But that provides a kind of continuity. Even as you're changing, you're keeping the same alphabet.
I used to think that there were all these newspapers in New York that were written in Hebrew, but I realized, then I began to understand it wasn't Hebrew at all, it's Yiddish.
Right.
Yeah. There used to be quite a few Yiddish dailies.
Yeah. And with huge
And in
circulation.
Chicago, too.
Yeah, exactly. There were Yiddish language wire services that would send out stories to all the Yiddish papers in all the local areas. It was a major industry. Anyways, we'll talk more about the languages next time.
Yeah.